Hi everyone, this is Donna and welcome to the Whimsy Stamps channel. Today I'm sharing a mini Slimline thankful card with you. For today's card I'm using the newly released Simple Sentiments Strips clear stamp set, and I'm also going to combine that with this previously released Butterflies clear stamp set. To get started on this card, I'm going to stamp out the 3 images of the butterflies from the stamp set, and I'm using Bristol Smooth cardstock. I am using my Misty to help me stamp that out because I want to be sure that I get a nice and crisp impression since I'm going to be clear heat embossing the images. I've treated my cardstock with some anti-static powder, and then I'm just inking out my images with Versa Fine Onyx Black ink. I make sure that I have a pretty good amount of the ink onto my image, and then I'll stamp that down. Now there was some part of the images that didn't stamp out completely, and I just went in again and I stamped those out, I think 2 times. So here I'm just adding my clear embossing powder, and then I can shake off the excess and melt the embossing powder with my heat gun. I used my scan and cut to cut the images out, leaving a small border around them. I had no problem cutting out the images after I've clear embossed them, just in case you're interested in knowing that. For the coloring of these images, I'm using my Spectrum Noir Sparkle Glitter Brush pens, and I'm going to use just 3 markers to color in the images. I'm using Barn Red, Tangerine, and Firefly, and I just have squeezed out a small amount onto a piece of acetate sheet. And I'm actually dipping, my brush is empty, my water brush is empty, so I feel like that gives me better control, and I'm just dipping the brush into a little cup of water that's right next to me to rinse it off, and then I'm using that little brush to pick up the color and add it to my image. So for this large image, I kind of wanted some of those openings of the butterfly to have this ombre look from the Barn Red into the Tangerine color. And then some of them I just colored in with the Firefly just to give the image a lot of contrast. So a fun little fact about me, a couple of years ago, I actually raised butterflies. Or I guess technically I raised caterpillars that transformed into monarch butterflies. And of course I went a little overboard and made the process a little bit more difficult than what it needed to be. And I just kind of burnt out. But I do hope to in the spring to take up the hobby again because I really did enjoy it. There was just something so magical about seeing this little caterpillar that my daughter, she called them chewies because they would just eat everything in sight. And then you kind of get to see them go into this chrysalis and emerge and come out as a butterfly, and then you get to set them free. So it was just something so very special about that whole process that I shared with my daughter, and I hope to get back to that again. So anyway, back to the coloring. I do color the other 2 butterflies off screen. For one of them, I omit the darkest color, which is the Barn Red. And for the last small little butterfly, I just use the Firefly marker, which is just the yellow shade. And I don't know if the camera is doing the images any justice, but when you look at this in person, there's just so much shimmer on the image itself. I mean, it's shining like a Christmas tree. So anyway, for the Slimline card, I have a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock that I've cut down to 4 1/4 by 7 1/4. And I'm calling this a Slimline card because typically the Slimline cards are typically more narrow and a little bit longer. I don't know if there's like a hard rule to follow for the measurements, but I basically needed a wider card base for my images to fit, and I didn't want it too long, so frankly, I just came up with this measurement just arbitrarily, and I'm calling it a mini Slimline. Truth be told, I don't know if that's accurate, but it's my card, and that's what we're going with. So anyway, I'm going to do some ink blending onto that panel, and I'm starting with Blueprint Sketch Distress Oxide ink. I'm just trying to get a good thick layer on that panel, and I am going in with a pretty heavy hand to add that ink. Once I have half of that panel inked up, I'll go ahead and rotate my panel and then just add the same ink onto the other side. And it does take a little bit of effort to get a nice smooth look across the entire panel. And then once I have that complete, I go ahead and I ink up just the edges around using the chipped sapphire. I switched from the blender brush to using the foam ink tool. I wanted to be sure that I just got that chipped sapphire at the edges, and I feel like using the foam ink tool gives me a little bit better control. Once I went all the way around the edge with the chipped sapphire, I went back to the blender brush with the Blueprint Sketch ink still on that brush and just kind of blended out where the two colors meet. I went back and forth a couple of times between the brush and the foam ink tool and really smoothed out the blend and made sure I had no harsh lines between one color and the next. Then I grabbed my distress sprayer and I spritzed the panel with some water, and then I blotted it dry with a clean paper towel. And of course, it wouldn't be one of my cards unless I had some splatters on there. So I have the panel inside of my splatter box and some diluted white acrylic paint that I'm just splattering the entire panel with a paintbrush. The panel had time to completely dry, and I'm at a point where I'm ready to start putting my card together. Now, off screen, I stamped out the sentiment from the Simple Sentiment Strips clear stamp. I chose Especially for You and with heartfelt thanks. I did stamp them out onto a piece of black cardstock that I heat embossed with white embossing powder, and then I just trimmed them down to small strips. I really wanted a gold frame to set my card with, and since this is an atypical card size, I kind of had to piece one together. So it was relatively easy to create my own frame, and just off screen I die cut a frame that I used two rectangle dies that I taped together to create this frame, and then I die cut two mirror gold cardstock frames and 4 from heavyweight white cardstock. And then you saw me earlier, I just trimmed out the edge of one of the, or both of the mirror gold cardstocks, and then I pieced them together. So here I wanted to create a little bit of dimension on that frame, and that's where I'm going to use the additional frame die cuts from the white cardstock. I'll do the same thing I did with the gold cardstock and just trim off the edge of one of the frames, and then adhere that down using some liquid adhesive. And then once I have that in place, I just try to line it up as best as I can, and then kind of use my fingers to press it in place. So then I'll work on the other side, and again I start by trimming off one of the edges from the die cut, and then I'll adhere it just to the part where the first one ends. And then I can just trim the rest of it off and lay it down in place so that the entire frame stays level. It sounds more complicated than what it is, but basically I'm just creating some dimension and I'm trimming off where they overlap so that they would sit level on my card front. And then off screen, I'll go ahead and add another layer, and you're not having to sit through this relatively tedious part of the card. Once everything is secured, I just add a couple of acrylic blocks to the frames to kind of set them in place. And then I'm ready to start adhering my focal point elements. So here's kind of the layout of the card, and I debated back and forth between adding that third butterfly, but I do go ahead and add them in the end. So I'm placing those sentiment strips kind of strategically, or at least that top one, so that it covers up the seam where the gold cardstock meets. Honestly, it's hardly noticeable, but the perfectionist in me won't allow me to just let it be. So we're just going to cover that up. And there you saw me take a little piece of cardstock and add it to just part of the sentiment strip. And that's because my foam tape that I have on the back of the sentiment is just a little bit higher than that gold frame that I created. And just adding that little piece of cardstock kind of lifts that portion of the sentiment so that it sits evenly. And then this little butterfly, the very bottom of the wing is going to cover up the second seam. And basically that is all for my card. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Let me know what you think about this card in the comments down below. And as always, thank you so much for stopping by and spending a little time with me. I hope you have a fantastic week ahead, and I will see you another time.